Welcome to Living Western, a show dedicated to telling the real story of the rural American West through individual stories of the amazing people who call this part of the world home. Thank you for joining us again, folks. This is part 2 of episode number 3 with J.B. Zielke, author of The Lost Cowboy. In this episode, we're going to get into some pretty deep stuff. JB's going to talk about his experiences cowboying in countries all around the world. We're going to talk about human nature, government, the lack of government, and we're also going to talk about some of the real risks and dangers of living and working abroad in these other foreign lands, and contrast that to what it's like to be an American citizen and enjoying the freedoms and safety that we have here. Now, let's pick up where we left off in part 1 with J.B. Zielke.
The whole point, the whole reason I was there was to learn from these people and immerse myself as much as I could. So every chance I got to do anything, I would do it, and I would do it to the best of my ability. And I wasn't good at any of it, but I tried it as much as I could. And I would run into other travelers in some of these places, and I'd watch them not try something or have something like that offered to, like they'd say, do you want to go rope these horses out of the corral? And people would be scared or timid. They would never get asked again. And it became my job to go rope these horses. Just as an example, like if you weren't open and willing to try, you might get hurt, you might look stupid. But if you're not willing to try, well, then they're probably not going to ask you again, and you can just sit on the sidelines and watch it.
Well, there's a quote that I wrote down out of your book that is kind of along those same veins. And it's not so much about, specific tasks, but one thing that really stuck out to me when I read your book, and it's not like a foreign concept, but the way you worded it, I thought was fantastic. And that is, when people see you giving it your all, that is when they will help you, teach you, and invite you into their world. I thought that was super powerful, and what you just told me was a good example of that.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, you don't need to. I don't speak Mongolian, and very, very few Mongolians speak English, and you don't need to speak their language for that to translate. They can see that very easily, whether you're willing to try it. And even if you screw up, I mean, they probably expect you to screw up. I would, if somebody came over here and thought they were just going to walk onto a ranch and know everything. I would expect them to screw up a lot. But if you're willing to learn and fix your mistakes and try it again and try and do better, I think, that has nothing to do with language. It's entirely action, and people appreciate that, whether you're Australian, Argentinian, Mongolian, Swedish, wherever. People appreciate that.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what aspect of life either. Um, that's a lesson I wish I would have learned younger. I grew up on a big place that was very proactive, and they had learned a lot of lessons over 100 years of ranching that I took for granted. I saw it, this is the way we do it, and this is why. But then if I'd go work somewhere else, sometimes I'd struggle with, we would be out working, and I'd just constantly be in my head like, why on earth are you doing it that way? You could do it another way, and it'd be 10 times easier. And it took me a while, I'm ashamed to say, to finally figure that out, that it's not worth saying anything most of the time. If you just walk into a new situation, you keep your mouth shut and your eyes open and your ears open. I'm not saying there's not a better way, but you cannot respect why they do something the way they do until you really observe it and learn it. And
Hmm.
eventually I did figure that out, but it took me too long. Like I wish I would have learned it, and it would have saved me some, weird uncomfortable situations in some of the outfits that I worked on later as a young man. I really appreciated that in your book, because that statement right there is universal truth, and it doesn't matter if it's ranching, cowboy culture, or in urban culture, in any sort of career that you go into it, have a good attitude. You can't learn anything when you're talking, though. So keep your mouth shut, absorb
Hmm.
everything that you can. And then if at some point they're, they want your help or they want your perspective, they'll ask for it.
That's exactly right. That I was gonna say that if you don't usually have to question whether or not somebody wants your opinion on something. They'll ask you about it, or they'll pay you if they want you to come in and consult on what they're doing wrong. They will pay you to come in and be a consultant and bring your expertise, or at the very least, they'll ask you, "What do you think about this?" But that doesn't happen all that often, especially if you're a new guy on the block just coming in. No, nobody asks you your opinion, and they will eventually, but that was something I learned as well. Nobody, I would do my very best to not, unless I was asked, tell them, well, this is how we do it in the U.S. And a lot of people would ask, as long as there wasn't too much of a language barrier. People were always
Right.
curious. How do you do this back in the States? What's the normal way of doing this or that? And I was
Right.
happy to tell them. But until they asked me that, they didn't. They weren't asking me to come over there and teach them anything.
Right. Well, on the subject of the different ways of doing things, my current career is around natural resources and conservation. I work for a federal agency. In your experience in all these different countries and different continents and different cultures, when it comes to the land and land management, just a little while ago you brought up in Mongolia, there's no private property and there's no fences. How do they manage their natural resources, and how do they keep those uh, in good condition? How do they have a sustainable ecosystem and then a sustainable grazing resource if they don't have a lot of control? Is it all just in herding?
Yeah, um, Mongolia, for example, I would not say they. I don't think they do a good job of managing their natural resources, specifically because if you own 200 horses and you look at that ground and say, well, that's it's pretty barren, we should probably move on to some better grass and let this come back. uh, your neighbor will run his horses right onto it. There is no government. There's nobody telling them what to do, and it shows. I mean, I think Mongolia on the steppe, because that's where horses kind of originated from. That ecosystem is somewhat adapted to it, but I saw a ton of overgrazed stuff over there, and it's because there's no policing of that. But other like in Africa also the the government is almost non-existent. They have very little power and they do very little. But there is private land there, so they're they're more aware of what they're doing by overgrazing or overhunting or whatever. They're aware that that's an issue, and it that just becomes down to the landowner how you take care of your land. And I saw a lot of African farmers and ranchers they were very good about taking care of their land, making sure it wasn't overgrazed, rotating crops, things like that. They were well aware of it because it was theirs, and they didn't want 10 years down the line for the land to be useless. Places like Sweden, where the government was hugely influential and almost controlled your entire life, the government would just come in and tell you what to do. There was very little uh, decision making because you just had to do what they said. In Sweden, hormones are illegal. So you can't synchronize cattle to breed them. Um, you can't fertility test bulls. That's illegal. You can't brand cattle, that's illegal. You can't rope cattle, that's illegal. You can't leave cattle outside at night in the wintertime, that's illegal. So if you run 1,000 cows, that means you need one of those giant dairy barns or whatever that would hold 1,000 animals. Specifically, the ranch that I worked on actually went to court and fought the government and got the right to keep their cattle outside because they were the biggest ranch in all of Scandinavia, and they were able to change that. But the majority of ranches in Sweden or cattle operations, those animals spent half their time indoors because they felt like the government told them that they had to be inside. And then you'd go look at these animals, and they're just standing in a dark room, basically, in manure, and not living
Yeah.
they're living a much worse life than the cattle that were outside that had to have a lawsuit fought against the country for years just to get the right to keep them outside. So I don't natural resources stuff in Sweden. They did. I don't think they told you too much about what you could do with the land, your own land. But the weird thing there was a cap on how much land you could privately own. So I don't know what that cap was, but the reason the ranch I worked for was the biggest one in Scandinavia is because they actually leased a military base. Otherwise, it's impossible to privately own enough land in Sweden to run a bunch of cattle. Even the logging crews or the logging companies, which generally, like in the United States, they own huge amounts of land. Over there, they would have to buy a chunk of land, log it, and immediately sell it so they could move to the next chunk and log that because they were constantly bumping up against their cap of how much land that they could privately own. So I was very weird ranching over there because the government was so uh, in the middle of your entire life, running everything that you do. The majority of ag there was subsidized, like a crazy amount of subsidization, where it was in some cases more profitable to own an 8 cow dairy than it was to run 200 beef cattle because of subsidies.
Having that experience in Sweden and seeing that side of agriculture, what are some things that are maybe a cautionary tale to the US? Like, there's a lot of people in the US that would love to see a cap on private land ownership, but they don't understand the realities of what happens when you're limited to how many cattle you can run. And in Sweden, that's a crazy low limit. Then you're limiting your profit. You're limiting what you're able to do as far as a business. You're not going to stay in business long. Therefore, like, our whole food supply would be at risk if we start putting caps on
Mm-hmm.
private land. How do they do that in Sweden? Are they importing all their or a good share of their meat?
I think they did import quite a bit. Another huge thing is income tax over there. That they I forget exactly what it was, but it's like 50 or maybe over 50% income tax. Because of that, the expense of a company to have an employee was so high that it was much cheaper in the long run to buy equipment that would do the job for workers. So like dairies over there, every dairy I saw or heard about was entirely a robot run dairy. There would be one guy probably pushing buttons. Their feed was all put out by conveyor belts and mixers, and it was almost entirely automated, which was cool to see. But then you think about it, and none of these places can afford to have employees, and so there was a lot of things. I think you could look at Sweden or just the EU in general and look at what they do with agriculture and see that the government overstep is a horrible thing because you're putting a lot of decision making in the hands of people that don't know what they're talking about, or they're not boots on the ground. And that's not to say that everybody is, but at the end of the day, you have just kind of relinquished your power to run your own business by and giving it to somebody that you hope is going to make smart decisions for your industry. So in Sweden, their cattle that I've heard a lot of people for years in the U.S. they've been talking about cattle tracking and I forget what you call those RFID tags or whatever they are, and
Yep.
making them uh, so that cattle must have them in the U.S., which makes a lot of sense in some aspects for traceability. If there's a disease outbreak or whatever, that they can trace exactly where that animal came from. But at the same time, the government over there in Sweden, on any given day, EU appointed vets could show up on that outfit and tell us to stop what we were doing. And you couldn't say no, or you would go to jail or have some sort of penalties. And you have to stop what you were doing, and they would say, "We want you to bring this bunch of cattle into the corrals, and we're going to randomly test five of them or however many they pick, and we'd have to sort out the ones that they wanted, put them in a pen, and put down a tarp and wait for those cattle to pee on the tarp so that they could do a urine sample from each animal." But that's an entire day or maybe multiple days of work that you had to do. And from the government side of things, that's probably the only way you can police that. If you're going to make so many things illegal and try and have your nose in the middle of all of it, that probably is the only way that they could legitimately do that. But from the rancher's point of view, you're missing a lot of days where the government just comes in and takes over what you do, and they know exactly how many cattle you own, they know exactly what those cattle weigh, they know every single vaccine that those cattle have received, or antibiotics if they have had antibiotics. And I mean, I see both sides of it. I understand how all those things are important. I don't know that the government is necessarily the person that should be in charge of that, but maybe there's no other way. But it made ranching very difficult over there.
Given my career in the federal government, um, it's a little bit challenging for me sometimes because I have the same feelings, I have the same concerns. Whether it's technology or financial incentives through subsidies or whatever, there are benefits to those things. There are benefits to the technology, like traceability, like you mentioned. But the more dependent that you get on technology and the more dependent that you get on government funding, the more control you give up. And that scares me as far as the future of American agriculture. Again, I'm not saying that government programs are bad, and I'm not saying the technology is bad, but if we're not careful, it can get taken too far. And when I'm talking about the financial stuff, I want to clarify, like, there's a lot of good that comes out of some of these financial programs, like the ones that I've worked in for many years, that help ranchers or farmers get into a more efficient way of doing something that they couldn't have afforded, the financial, the capital to get into that more efficient way of doing things. So a government program helps them in that way. But my concern is, and something I've witnessed that really scares me, is we have a big generational transition happening right now. And there's operations that have the government money, taxpayer money, they're basically in their business plan, and they budget those. And that
Mm-hmm.
scares me, that they're running their operation not just 1, 2, 3, 4 years, but long term with a dependency on taxpayer money. And the danger in that is I feel like we're almost incentivizing bad management. We're almost
Mm-hmm.
incentivizing a lack of innovation and a dependency of this next generation of agriculture coming up on government programs and technology. What you're talking about with Sweden is just, to me, is like a red flag saying, hey, we got to be careful or we're going to end up like that down the road.
Yeah, and I don't that is another big point that I learned in traveling is that I don't have the answers to anything. More that I have just learned that there's even more problems than I knew existed, and I know even less than I thought is what I've learned. And so I don't know the correct answer to that to how much the government should be involved. I've seen both sides of
Right.
it. I understand both sides of it, and I don't know the correct mixture that would make things work because I've also been in countries where there's no government whatsoever, and there are downfalls to that as well.
100%. That is one of the dangers of capitalism, and I'm a capitalist, but at the same, there is a balance there because in a capitalistic society, there are a few people out there, there's a few businesses out there that are long term visionaries. They will plan for sustainability for long term. But there are so many operations, whether in ranching or outside of ranching, that they will, in a ranching world, they will take every blade of grass they can to get the biggest check that year and hope that it comes back
Hmm.
next year. And in some cases that can be extremely hard on the land. And we can drive anywhere around the western United States and you can see people who manage the land very well, and you can see a piece of ground that's nothing but prickly pear cactus now because it's been overgrazed for so long. And in the absence of any sort of check and balance, and if you got rid of regulations altogether, there's a danger of kind of a rape and pillage of your resource. So you're right, there is a balance to it.
Hmm.
What the correct balance is, I don't think anybody knows, but as long as we're striving to try and find a balance, I think that's where we need to head.
Hmm. It's a step in the right direction.
So we've talked about Australia a little bit, Sweden. Africa was one that I was fascinated about in your book. And one of the things about your time in Africa that fascinated me, what came down to like one paragraph, and it was around the way Africans look at how they live life and how they spend money. Can you talk a little bit about that and share a little bit about that perspective from, you grew up here in America, and, what you experienced there was a complete opposite.
Right. Yeah. So I thought I had a basic understanding of, but well, I do have a basic understanding of personal budgeting and the American way of thinking about how you should spend your money. And when I was in Africa, I was in northern South Africa at this point, and I was digging out a big old stock tank with three or four other guys that had a bunch of silt built up in the bottom of it. So we're just standing in 4 or 5 inches of muck with shovels, and it's 100 degrees, and we're just chucking this muck over the side of the tank. And we talked about all kinds of different things, and they started to make fun of this guy that worked on the ranch named Bungani, and Bungani was the only guy working there that he so in South Africa specifically, there's a lot of different tribes of people, and to the untrained eye, if you're not from there or haven't spent a lot of time there, you probably couldn't tell. But native South Africans are a lot lighter skinned people. They're still black, but much lighter skinned. And then there's these other groups. There's Zulus and Sutus and Swatis and all these different tribes that came in over the past hundreds of years. They came. A lot of them came down with Shaka Zulu when he was conquering a lot of southern Africa, and those people are much darker skinned. And so, as outsiders, we don't really see that, but South Africans notice that sort of stuff immediately. They know what, because all those different tribes speak their own language, and so they can tell, they know exactly which tribe you're a part of from the get go. And so Bungani was not um, like the rest of the guys on the crew. And so these guys were all talking about, they all spoke Afrikaans as their first language, but they all spoke English as well. And they were talking about um, spending all their money. They're, like I was saying, these guys make probably between $300 and $500 a month as their pay. And these guys, especially the young guys, would go into town and they would spend almost all of that the day that they were paid. And a lot of them had kids and wives and stuff at home that would just be, they'd go buy a bag of mini meal, they called it. And that it was just, it's like cream of wheat, but made out of corn. It's just bleached, ground up corn. And it was cheap. You could buy a 50-pound sack of it, had zero nutritional value basically, but people would live off that. That was all they ate. So these guys would go into town and buy a bag of that to feed their family for the month, and then blow the rest of it getting drunk and partying in town. And I brought that up to him. I said, why don't you ever save some of it, or buy buy something nice that you could use for a long time rather than just getting drunk. And they brought up Bungani because Bungani was the only farm worker that owned a car, and he had this old crappy Volkswagen Golf. But for them, that was a really nice car, and I don't think he could hardly afford to put fuel in it to drive it around, but he owned it. And Bungani lived a very sparse life. Bungani didn't get drunk. He didn't go out and party with these guys, but he had something nice, and they would kind of criticize him because of that. And they thought it was almost like kind of cowardly that he wasn't living like every day was his last. And so basically, these guys told me, they said, we we spend our money that way because we don't know if we're going to wake up tomorrow. And I think in modern countries and industrialized countries, society as a whole does a really good job of making sure that you don't see death and hopefully don't fear it too much. And I read a book by, I'm trying to think of his name. Uh, he's a big wave surfer, and he talked about that because he lived in these Polynesian cultures where death is very open. They parade dead bodies through the streets and stuff as a celebration of life. And after the Industrial Revolution, where they're trying to convince you that you should care about a 40-year career and having a 401k when you're done, and that your golden years will be the best years of your life, you have to believe that in order to be able to be willing to give your life to a career, or give 40 years of your life to a career. These guys were never taught that, and they're very aware. And that death is all around you in Africa. People die all the time. Life is cheap. You see it, and people live accordingly because of that. And they know that they could be walking home from work one day or riding in the back of the truck, and tires blow out all the time on those crappy trucks, and they turn over and kill 20 people. And those guys know that, and they don't live in fear, but they are much much more present in their everyday life than the average American. And so these guys spent their money that way. I don't necessarily think that that's the right way, but I think a lot of Americans could take a serious step back and look at their lives and try and think if they really are living presently, because people just plain forget that you can die at any point. And we do everything we can as a society to keep people thinking that way, because it's part of the glue that holds society together. It's part of what gets people to live kind of sedentary lives, and you know and just commit to things, which is not wrong. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's a very different way of thinking when you see death every day, when you realize that life is short, and it changes your perspective. And so those guys would spend their money very quickly and sometimes foolishly, um, because another point to that is, they told me, they said, if we die, African tradition, South African tradition, our family just spends our money. That money goes straight to our family. And when people die in Africa, they just have a big party with their money. So if you have $200 that you might have saved, that's going to buy $200 worth of booze and food, and everybody's going to celebrate and mourn you, and you're done. If you have $15,000, the party's just going to go on longer. But it's you're not passing down any sort of generational wealth or anything like that. So these guys told me, they said, I can either save this money and be hungry and not have a great life, and then if I die, other people get to have fun with my money, or I can have fun with it while I'm here. And if I happen to die tomorrow, at least I died knowing that I had as much fun as I could possibly have.
Well, I think there is a big lesson to be learned there. Like you said, I don't know that living just for the moment is the best way to go about things, but there's usually some sort of balance to everything in life. Um, you know, just saving and working and planning for this hopeful retirement 30, 40 years from now, based on however old you are, seems pretty risky when you could die the day before you retire, and all of that was for naught. I want to talk
Mm-hmm.
more about Africa and some of the things that you experienced there, but while we're on the subject of like the way people view life, um, my cousin here about 4 years ago, him and his wife, they lived in South Texas and they had nice home businesses. They had three adolescent boys, three young boys, and they kind of just got fed up with the American dream that they were living, and they were worried about their boys and how they viewed the so-called American dream as they got older. Uh, my cousin Chris and his wife sold everything that they owned, bought a motor yacht, fixed it up, and they spent the last 4 years living on a boat, traveling the Bahamas, going to different places around the Florida coast and the Keys. And Chris learned how to scuba dive, got certified as an instructor. Jolene had different things that she was doing. Uh, they were just making money however they could, wherever they were at, but also trying to show the boys that you didn't have to get stuck in a graduate high school, go to college, try and get a good job, and live your life for retirement when you're in your 60s. And I have so much respect for them. For I mean, they literally put their lives on hold to show their children a different way of looking at things, so that they didn't get, when they got to be old enough to make that decision on college and career, they could do it with an open mind. And that's something valuable, I think, that you've experienced, that I think people could glean from your book and from what you have to say, is to look at life maybe in some different ways other than just the American dream.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful thing that they did, going off. And I mean, a lot of I'm guilty of it myself. I mean, it's once you kind of get sucked into this idea of the American dream, it's really, really scary to feel like you're stepping out of the race for a while. You're going to lose for sure if you decide to pull over and take a break. And that was I actually learned a lot about that after the book came out, because I had every intention of continuing to. I mean, during the years that I was writing or living the story that's in this book, I was spending between 3 and 6 months out of the year out of country, and coming back here and going to my grandpa's place, and when I would come back just completely broke, and make enough money to I'd make like $2,000, and that was enough to buy a plane ticket and go find somewhere else to live for a while. And I had no issue with that when I was doing it all the time, and it became normal to me, and I intended to continue doing that. And then COVID happened, and it shut down all of my plans, and I couldn't travel internationally anywhere for a couple years. And that was the first time in my adult life that I had no other choice but to work. Even what I'm doing now, where I travel a bunch to all these different shows and venues and people's places and shoot videos with them, I don't even know that that would have been possible at that time. And so because of that, I had no choice but to settle down um, and just work and make some money and try and make something for myself without just being a bouncing ball flying around wherever I wanted to go. And so jumping back into this the video stuff I started doing, there was definitely a big barrier there to do I really just quit this job that pays me a fairly good normal paycheck and go chase this? And and I did, and I'm glad I did. I've been, I haven't worked for anybody really in 2 years. I've been, running my own business basically. And but even now, I've been trying to plan these trips outside the country again, and they there's these barriers that I don't ever remember being there when I did it the first time. And now I running my own company, I'm afraid of, oh, well, I'm going to miss this show. I'm going to miss this opportunity with this artist. I'm going to miss that shoot, miss this, that, all these streams of income, all this stuff. And it, I realized that as I was planning these trips again, trying to get things going again. And it gave me kind of some insight to how everybody else feels that when they say, I wish I could go do that, but I can't. And it's just a little bit because I'm still just a drifter with nothing tying me down anywhere. But even just that little bit makes me think about people with kids and families and serious jobs or their own business or whatever. I never really understood it until it started to happen to me a little bit.
It's a powerful thing. Security is a wonderful thing, and I'm going through this in my own life at the time. So this is hitting home real hard because security is important, especially when you have a family. I have 3 kids and a wonderful wife. We both work, and I've been in a job that I don't necessarily love for the last 7+ years. And there's not a lot of other jobs in my area that give me the income, the health insurance, the retirement, all of those things that are stability and security. But what I'm finding as I'm aging is that security is super valuable, but it's also kind of become a little bit of a prison. There's a lot of things that I don't do now, or things that I used to think about, oh man, it'd be great to do that someday, I'll do it. I've kind of let a lot of that go because I've gotten hooked on the security. It's like an addiction. And I'm really
Mm-hmm.
conflicted about it because on one hand it is really important to take good care of your family and to, be responsible about your future, but at the same time, I don't want to be living for the hope of a future that may not even happen. I had 2 coworkers not that long ago that were talking about their career, and a couple of them were talking about, man, they'd like to go do something else, but they're my age, or late 30s, early 40s. And the one guy said, well, I just got 12 years left till I can retire, and then I can do what I want. And I appreciated what they were saying. I know the context that they were saying it in, but that hit me as, you're choosing to be miserable for 12 years in the hope that, you know, day one after that's over, you're just going to go do stuff and enjoy it and go explore. And it just hit me that, it's dangerous to think that way, because I don't want to be 65 years old and then have freedom, but not physically be able to go do the things that I want to do. So, what we have done in our own life and our own family over the last couple of years is really started to sacrifice a little bit of that security and that future to do things now. My oldest 2 kids live in a different state. They're from my first marriage. I don't get to be the everyday dad with them, and they're growing up so fast and they're involved in all these sports and everything. And I can't have them as much as I used to. And that's really hitting me. I mean, they're growing into adults right in front of me, and I'm missing out on so much. And my wife and I sat down and just decided that it may cost us some more money now that we could save up for the future, but we need to do some memorable things, take the kids and go some places that they might not ever go otherwise, and show them some of our world and have those memories and that experience now. Because at the end of the day, the most valuable thing we have on our deathbed is those memories. And
Hmm.
if we don't make them, we lose.
Yeah,
So I,
I just think it's terribly sad when people come up to me, specifically old folks that tell me, "Gosh, I really wish I could have done that." And you can see on their face and in their eyes that they just physically can't now do these things. And I'm glad I can tell them the stories and maybe shed some insight on it. But that is 100% the biggest fear I have in my life is to get to the end, whenever that may be, and be sitting there regretting not doing this or that. And I could see that being costly also if you're not careful, um, about you don't just need to do everything on a whim just to say you did it. But at the same time, I can't imagine, and I don't want to ever experience the feeling of getting to a place where I'm seriously carrying some heavy weight regret of not going and doing something that I always wanted to do.
yeah, my former coworker, he got the opportunity to go work in Hawaii, still in a government job, good secure job, but moving to Hawaii from here in Southwest Montana, he dreamt of living here his whole life, but he got this opportunity, and he was hemming and hawing about it. And one day I said, John, on your deathbed, you're never going to look back and be like, sure am glad I didn't take that opportunity to get paid to live in Hawaii for a while. I said, the opportunities like that don't come along every day. And, you let an opportunity pass because of a security and to stay in what you may regret it someday. So, yeah, man, I really appreciate what you're saying there. And I'm trying to learn as I go through my own journey in life to be more in the moment and to make more memories while I'm here, not just planning for up ahead. But um, on that note of memories made, you've recorded a lot of memories in this book, but do you have any memories that really stick out to you that you're going to treasure forever, um, from the human aspect, like relationships that you made? Any in particular that are really noteworthy?
Yeah, the a lot of the relationships I made traveling um, are kind of interesting because in this day in this day and age, at least in America, we're used to it's kind of hard to lose a person. I mean, people can disappear, but we have social media and telephones and all of this stuff that, even if you don't see a person for years, you can stay in contact, stay friends. So a lot of the relationships I made overseas are a little bit different from that because there's not really a good way to stay in contact with these people. So I had some very meaningful relationships that I made with different people around the world, and but they're almost like snapshots of my life because I haven't heard or talked to those people in a long time, or since I saw them in person. Um, but one of my best, I made two really good friends in Africa. Roche, I talked about him in the book. I went hunting with him, but he's a veterinarian over there, and he's one of the few guys I still do talk to over there because he's more modern probably than the average African is. But we still talk every once in a while, and I learned a ton from Riche, and Riche's a white guy, and so learning from white Africans, they kind of face a very different set of issues than people do in the U.S. or even the majority of Africa does. So I learned a lot from him about that. I think I talked about it in a book. In the book, there's one part where Riche told me one night when we were. I mean, I've for the past 8 years now, maybe I've done nothing but live on people's couches and live in my car. So he was saying how he thought that would be kind of heavy and hard for him to do, but he was like, man, I guess if I had to choose one or the other, I'd rather have a little and see a lot of the world rather than having the world and really or having a ton of stuff and not getting to go see anything and just living in my little world. So he shed a lot of, he's a very insightful guy, very smart guy. Also, Batman, my friend over there, his nickname's Batman, and he he's a black guy that's the same age as me, and he overcame some incredible things in his life to get to where he was. He had a high school education, which was a big deal, just having a high school education. And um, when I met him, whenever this 5, 6 years ago, whenever that was, he he was a ranch manager for a place, and in the U.S. we don't really think too. It's a good job, but it's not groundbreaking that you're a ranch manager. And he told me that he, as a ranch manager, was making 10 times the combined income of his parents, what they made his entire life. And so it was a huge jump in income for him. And so he's come a long way. He started his own business and everything now, and he's a super inspiring person that I still stay in touch with. Um, a lot of those Australian guys that I became really close with, that bull catching in Australia is it's a young man's game, and you don't really run into a lot of old folks, and by old I mean 30 plus at that in that area. You don't really run into people like that out there unless they're ranch managers or something like that. But even then, they're few and far between. So we were a pretty rough and rowdy and wild crew when I knew those guys, and I learned a ton about try and determination and being open minded to try and things that were horrifying, really. But a lot of those guys have kind of grown up. Some of them got married, some got kids, and they're not living that chapter of their life anymore, where they're out there, looking death in the eye all the time, like we were doing when I was over there. So they've changed a lot, and I'd love to see a lot of those guys again because I'm sure they're very different people and have a lot different uh, outlook on life at this point. Um, but yeah, there's most of the guys I hung out with in Mexico that were great friends to me. I never heard from them again. Um, I don't know if they really have the means to communicate. Most of the African guys, other than those two that I mentioned, I know for a fact they don't have the means to communicate. They don't have phones or anything like that. The Mongolians, um, none of them spoke English, or maybe one guy spoke a little bit, but he doesn't know how to read or write. So I we don't we don't really keep in contact either. Most of those friendships were snapshots of my life, and unfortunately not ongoing friendships.
Well, that's kind of where I was hoping you were going to go with it, because that phrase, snapshots in your life, I think is really important. And I think it is a really good lesson for anybody that reads your story, that you're going to meet a lot of people in your life, and you want to make the most out of the moments that you have with them, um, because you may never see that person again. And I just think that's a really valuable thing, to really change the way you look at relationships and the people that you meet, because they could have a big impact on your life. You may never see them again, but it's important to honor that moment that they had and that snapshot in your life. I really appreciate that perspective. Back to Africa. I've got a lot of questions about Africa because I would someday like to go. I've wanted to go hunt there for whatever reason. Since I was a kid, I've always wanted to get a gemsbok. But Africa is really fascinating to me, and South Africa in particular. You see it in the news that white landowners or farmers or ranchers are in a real dangerous situation. What is the reality of life over there for somebody in agriculture?
It absolutely is dangerous. Just everyday life, every single person living in Africa lives a more dangerous life than we do here. Um, but the landowners over there are are very much under attack, and it's a very political thing, and it depends on how you wanna look at it, and your outlook on things. There's When I was there, there was this political party that was coming to power at that time called the EFF. I think that's what they're called, EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and they're a communist party. And my understanding of South African government is that it's not like the U.S. where if you win 51% of the vote, you win the whole thing. Over there, for their legislation and all that stuff, if you win 25% of the vote, you get 25% of the votes in Congress. So this communist party in South Africa, uh, when I was there, I think was at 10 or 15% of the vote. But it was really scaring a lot of people that they're gaining traction because um, it was easy to see what they were doing advertising wise, because you could I was there during an election, and you could drive around and you would see one political party, um, their ad campaigns were not incredibly complex, but you needed to be able to read well to read the posters. And the EFF, their most of their advertising was 2 or 3 words, because they were doing a good job realizing that there is a huge amount of poor people in that country, and the majority of them, maybe not majority, but a lot of them can't read or can't read well. So they were kind of preying on these folks. And but the biggest scary thing was one of their biggest kind of points, selling points to people, was they wanted to push forward with land reclamation without compensation, meaning they were going to come take land back from white landowners, um, and gift it back to black farmers, which this is already happening in South Africa. There's a lot of programs that already exist there where they are, I don't know that they're necessarily forcing these owners off their land at right now, but they definitely are taking farms from white landowners and either giving them or making them incredibly cheap to black folks over there so that they can get into it. Which, the scary part for the people that are involved with it is, one, you could lose your farm or ranch, but also a lot of these people are either from Zimbabwe or direct descendants of people that were living in Zimbabwe when Joseph Mugabe did this, almost this exact same thing back in the 70s or I don't remember, 80s maybe, um, where all the land got taken back from white folks. And there was a lot of other changes going on at that time also, but uh, basically their money became worth nothing, and the country just kind of spiraled downwards because they weren't making the best economic decisions for the country. And so a lot of these people fled Zimbabwe and came to South Africa and bought land, or their parents did, or um, even if they weren't related to that at all, they surely knew the story. And so a lot of white South Africans see the writing on the wall that they, in my lifetime, they may need to leave because the government won't let them own anything there anymore. And so I'm not super well versed in all that, and I don't, I'm not claiming to be an expert on it because there's two sides to every story. But I know it's a very scary thing if you're a white landowner in South Africa, and that doesn't even touch on the violence. I mean, the violence is a whole different thing. That there's a lot of that too. There's a lot of farm murders that happen, disgruntled workers. There's also plenty of white landowners that treat their employees horribly, and I've seen it, and it's appalling, and it um, is things I'll never forget. But so sometimes these farm workers come back and kill these guys in the middle of the night, um, but also sometimes it's innocent folks caught in the crosshairs of it all, and it's all pretty horrible. But there's a lot of death and a lot of danger down there.
Was Africa the most dangerous place that you went in all your travels?
Probably as far as just the society itself, and that yeah, Africa was probably the most dangerous in the way where I was saying earlier that life is cheap down there. I mean, they think about life and death a lot differently, and so killing somebody or doing something that could kill you easily is just not really as big of a deal down there. Where now, Australia, the work we were doing every day was probably the most dangerous place as far as the work. Um, People got injured a lot catching those bulls like we were. Um, but African just everyday life was very dangerous. Parts of Argentina were too, um, but not as bad as South Africa.
Yeah, Argentina is another one that I'd like to go to someday. Yeah, either Argentina or Chile. But all I know is what I've seen on the news. Sometimes it seems like there's a little bit of unrest and stuff down there. So, having never been to any of those countries, I know nothing other than what I see on the TV or in the news, or I guess what I got out of your book. The danger is a big deal, though. When you talk about the Africans that you were around and how they don't put a lot of value on their own life, that would lead you to believe they probably don't put a lot of value on other people's lives either.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of crime down there, and there's also just a lot of really poor people that are, that not that it's right, but that a lot of them maybe don't see another way to make it work. So robbing rich white folks, they don't bat an eye at that because they're trying to feed their kids. And if you lose your iPhone, boohoo. And I saw a lot of that. So, um, I mean, I get it, and it's kind of just the nature of being in a country like that. That there's and it's not to scare people away from going down there. Um, South Africa is full of some of the most beautiful people I've ever met anywhere in the world. I mean, just incredibly kind, good people. But there is a lot of crime down there. Now, hunting, like you were saying, going down there to hunt, you're pretty shielded from that. You're kind of put into a bubble where, yeah, I would think you'd be very safe because the people I've talked to that went down there and hunted, they they pick you up from the airport. They take you straight to a very nice hunting camp, um, and you're pretty well protected, and you should be good. Those people know where you can drive and where you can't. Um, when I was down there, I was just working on these farms and stuff, so I got a little bit more insight into um, where you should and shouldn't go. And there was a lot of places that I went to that uh, they were very kind to me, and it was not an issue at all. But I had multiple people tell me in different scenarios in some neighborhoods, certain bars, restaurants. I'd go in there with my friend Batman, and they were very welcoming, and they'd tell me, we haven't had a white person in here in ever probably, or it's been years and years since there's been a white person in here, and they weren't saying get out or we don't want you here. They were just saying it's pretty cool that you don't care about the stereotypes down here, and you don't mind breaking out of the mold because most white South Africans wouldn't dare step foot in here. And the fact that you just hang out and it's no big deal, they they were very appreciative and incredibly kind to me. So I got to see parts of South Africa that you're not going to see if you go on a hunting trip or if you go to to Kruger and go on a safari. You know, that's really cool stuff, but culturally a lot different.
While we're on that subject of ranching and that culture, this just came to me. One of my dad's favorite movies when I was a kid, and just for the stunts, not for the acting, was Africa, Texas Style. Have you ever seen that?
No.
You need to watch it because you'll appreciate it. It's about these team, and it's an old movie. It's probably 60s or 70s, but it's about these team ropers that were hired to go to Africa and capture wild game by roping. And like I said, the acting is pretty awful, but the stunts. I mean, there's guys out there legitimately out there hauling butt across the savannah roping the craziest animals. So if you ever get a chance to watch that, do because you'll really appreciate it because you were there.
That's pretty wild. I know Hatari is kind of that way, that John Wayne movie, but
Yeah,
I'll have to watch that one. I've never seen it.
yeah, Africa, Texas style. It's got a lot of roping footage in it. Gosh, there's so much I want to talk to you about. Speaking about the danger, before I move on from that, reading in your book, it seems like Mexico is probably pretty high on your list for dangerous situations.
Yeah, yeah. Mexico, it's also, it's kind of a regional thing, just like it is in Africa. There's plenty of safe parts of Mexico, and a lot of people go to those parts of Mexico. You can go to Cancun or Playa del Carmen or Cozumel, whatever. I mean, those places in general are fairly safe, probably just as safe as a Chicago or New York City. But where I was for the majority of the time down there in Chihuahua, there was, um, yeah, there was a lot of dangerous stuff happening and dangerous people around, and um, basically the best thing I could do was just keep my mouth shut and avoid situations that were clearly dangerous or could get me in trouble. There was a few times where I messed up and I didn't. And I talked about a couple of them in the book there. Um, but it's a lot of it is just situational awareness because it's not good PR for um, those the cartels and stuff down there. It's obviously not good PR to be killing Americans all the time, and that they got better things to do. And so it's not like they're bounty hunters out there just looking to kill white folks, but
Right.
they are not going to hesitate for half a second if you put them in a situation where they need to kill you or want to kill you. So yeah, that was a lot of just keeping my mouth shut, looking the other way, situational awareness of that something that I heard a lot was, does this gringo speak Spanish? And as soon as I heard that, I would just turn and walk the other way because if they were worried about me hearing that conversation, it wasn't one I wanted to hear anyways. So I would just, as best I could, remove myself from situations like that. But yeah, there was um, a lot of shooting and killing and stuff on the news while I was down there. There was an American that got killed the next town over, or maybe it was a few towns away, but he got killed while I was down there and never saw him or met him or anything. But I guess he went down there and I don't remember the whole story, but he was just asking questions that he shouldn't ask. And what I heard was he was just kind of some frat boy kid who was going down there to get drunk and thought it'd be funny to ask questions about the cartel and stuff. And they thought he was special agent or something like that, and chopped them up and threw them in a barrel of acid or something like that.
This concludes part 2 of episode number 3 with author J.B. Zielke. I know we ended this one on a little bit of a darker note, but trust me, in the next episode, we're going to lighten it up a little bit, at least to start with. We'll get into some more deep conversation and some controversial stuff, actually. But I know you're going to love part 3, so stay tuned. If you are interested in purchasing a copy of JB's book, The Lost Cowboy, please see the link in the description below. I will also include links to JB's website and the website of Living Western. I really enjoyed this episode, and I hope you did too. You're listening to Living Western, and I'm Clayton Markser. We'll see you next time.